So welcome back to Bisrat for Africa. We're very excited today to be speaking to Pastor Afrika Mhlophe. He is one of our greatest exports here in the Eastern Cape, and he is also the pastor at Good News Community Church in Port Elizabeth. And he's a public theologian. I think you're doing your PhD at the moment, which you can share a little bit with us a little bit later. But he's also an author of a number of books, including this book right here, which we used to use in, I think it was my 3rd or 4th year at BTC. And so he's somebody who's been writing a lot about the topics that we cover in this channel. He is also the author of the book, A Passion for Position. He's also the author of the book, Freed by God, but Imprisoned by Culture. And his latest book at the moment is Turning from God to Diviners and Fortune Tellers. So yeah, we're very excited to have you here, sir. Maybe before we get into our questions for the day, won't you please share with us where you're at in terms of your ministry and your studies and so on?
Well, as you mentioned, I've got 4 books out, and I'm now busy with my PhD with Trinity College, which is based in the US. I do a lot of traveling for ministry, and yeah, that's basically what's happening around ministry.
Well, that's fantastic, sir. So we're quite honored to have you on our channel, and you're somebody who's been covering a lot of these topics that we're dealing with, and topics like, what does the Bible teach about veneration of ancestors? And are there any verses in the Bible that might seem to encourage the veneration of ancestors and all those sort of things? And so we think you're the right person to give us some perspective today. And so maybe beginning a little bit on the book that you've written, your latest book talks about turning from God to fortune tellers and diviners. And it's pretty much what's happening in our culture, in our nation. I think it's a global thing as well. If you look in America, a lot of Black people are actually moving that way. And so I suppose the first question would be, why are so many people actually turning away from Christianity, away from God, and sort of, turning to diviners and fortune tellers and sangomas and inyanga and so on?
I think the first thing that we need to highlight is perhaps the politicization of religion and how ideology sometimes hijacks people's ways of thinking. So a lot of people would have a perspective that Christianity is a foreign religion. They were on that way to that land. When they were in that land, on a journey to the promised land, that they had encountered God at Mount Sinai. And on this mountain, God proposed a covenant with the people of Israel, and they agreed to be in covenant with God. And then the law was given. The law was given because people had agreed to be in covenant with God. And the law is what prohibits divination, which means at a historical basis, we need to trace the practice as one that had been in the earth for thousands of years, already practiced by the Canaanites. The nations which God instructed to be annihilated from the face of the earth because of the level of abominations that they were doing. So for what you're talking about today, the incorporation of this practice into African culture is only a few hundred years old. So it's an African adoption, not an African invention. So people think that practice comes from them, whereas it comes from outside the culture and incorporated into the culture.
That's actually quite good that you've gone into that, because one of the things that a lot of people will pose is that it's my culture. And I once attended a funeral, and it was predominantly English-speaking, white cultured funeral. And after the funeral, the 2 people came up to the pastor and say, okay, so we're going to go speak to our ancestors now at the graveyard. And so I was sitting there as an African thinking, I don't believe, in speaking to the dead or venerating the dead. But here are 2 white people saying, we're going to go speak to our ancestors. And so a lot of people will say it's my culture. The Europeans do this, and the Indians do this, and the Chinese do this. And so how would you respond to somebody who sort of defends the practice through culture?
On the basis that it's one's culture, first of all, I would acknowledge that as a reality. And the issue is not that you are doing it. The issue is why it's being done. It's like, if you look at the Bible, for instance, it's a story of the man called Jeroboam. Jeroboam was the successor to King Solomon. Solomon, after he messed up and marrying so many foreign women, the kingdom was divided after his demise. Rehoboam had the 2 tribes of Israel, and Jeroboam was over the 10 tribes of Israel. And he instituted an idolatry in Israel where people worship 2 golden calves. That practice that by Jeroboam lasted over 300 years. By the time Josiah was born, the worship of Baal and idolatry was firmly entrenched in Israel. Yet the fact that the practice had been in practice for hundreds of years did not validate it before God's eyes. So God still judged Israel for Baal worship, even though Baal worship was firmly entrenched for hundreds of years. So it's important not for people to confuse their familiarity to the practice and the fact that they have emotional attachment to a practice with divine sanctioning. Truth is not truth because you believe in it. Truth is independent of your belief. And what is accepted by God is not exactly what you have been used to. You could have done something, your generation or your forefathers or predecessors could be doing something even for thousands of years. It doesn't mean it is actually correct before God's eyes. God's truth is transcendent, it's universal. It's not based on our belief. It's not based on us voting for it. So I agree, a person can defend because that's what they're used to. They've become emotionally invested in the practice. And they think their culture defines who they are. Here's a strange thing. My skin, which is the biggest organ of my body, I am told that the skin is a dominant factor in defining who I am. But when the person dies, we don't refer to the person's body as them. We say we have a view in the body. So the person's body is never the person. It's only the house the person is staying in. We talk about my eyes, my ears, my nose. Everything is mine. The body is mine. The body lies in state. The body is buried, but the person is not. So the person is not the body. At that level, we know that when the person has died. But then we confuse ourselves. It's like a secular argument. So I am not my skin because the skin is part of my body and I am not my body. So I dwell inside of my body. The culture that I practice is formed on the basis of the color of my skin. And therefore, how can the culture define me when it's based on my body and I'm not defined by my body? It's like a secular argument. It's secular, this whole thing. So when somebody dies, they immediately recognize that the person is distinct from their body. That the person is an immaterial object and the body is material. They don't have a problem with that. But then they go around again and make it as if the person's body is what contains the person. So going to the grave where the mortal remains are, talking to the person is now saying to yourself again, which is confusion, the person is there. But you've already told yourself when the person died, that the person has departed. Now all of a sudden, and the body is remaining here. But when you bury the body, it's confusing. So you're talking to the body that is mortally remaining and decomposing to a person you acknowledge has departed from the earth. So which one is it exactly?
Yeah, you gotta choose which one.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually quite good because I think, because in essence, I think a lot of people will make the argument from, not so much from truth, like what you're saying, but so much from, cultural identity and so on. But, what would you then say to those who sort of say, well, we don't necessarily worship our ancestors, but we are honoring them. So we are trying to, to honor what they've taught us and all those sort of things. And we honor them, obviously, by trying to consult with them. And so they're not saying we don't necessarily worship these people. We're just respecting them. And the Bible does say, honor your father and your mother and so on. So we're not worshiping.
Those are semantics. They're just using semantics because they've restricted worship. They have a reductionist understanding of worship. They think of worship as singing. They think of worship as bowing to a person. Worship is not those things. Those are expressions of worship. Worship is whatever you devote yourself to. Whatever has preeminence in your life, that's what you worship. So if the ancestors or the departed are the center of your life, that you don't make any major decisions without consulting them, and they are the one directing how you live your life, you're worshiping them. It's not about the fact that You are singing to them. You are bringing in. So with a reductionist mindset of worship is what we think it is when we go to church, when somebody plays a keyboard and starts a song. That's not worship. Music is only part of worship. Worship is greater than singing. Right? So when they say that, it's often they're using a reductionist mindset. They're worshiping the dead, just that they're not worshiping the way we understand or we have come to reduce worship to be. The Bible actually doesn't so much focus on worship, it's focused on serving. Thou shalt not serve. So worship is connected to what you're serving, what you devote, what is at the center of your life. When you're talking about honoring our parents, it's a misnomer. It's another misuse of words. The Bible never talks about honoring dead parents. We honor their memory, of course, because of what they taught. The Bible talks about, so, if we, and it happens a lot, we dishonor living people and we honor dead people. It's quite a strange thing that a person will get flowers for the first time when they're dead, and nobody bought them flowers when they're alive, when they could appreciate the flowers. When they're dead, everybody comes with flowers. So we have more respect for dead people than living people. People will dishonor their parents all their lifetime, but when they do a funeral, they do a massive funeral to show off and to have all of this thing they do in the name of honoring my mother and father. No, honor them when they're alive, when they can appreciate the honor. But the Bible says in Ecclesiastes 9 that the living know they shall die, but the dead know nothing. The memory of them, their love, their hatred has departed. They have no more participation on anything that is done under the sun. So they can't see what you're doing. I know people have had this belief that people are watching over me. They're not watching over you. Luke chapter 16, verse 19-31, the parable of a rich man and Lazarus. The rich man knew he's got 5 brothers. Not that he was watching over them, but he had memory. That is, there's consciousness in the afterlife. So he knew that he's got 5 brothers who need to be warned not to come to this place of torment. But he wasn't watching over them. He couldn't help them. He couldn't warn them. He couldn't reach out to them. He could do nothing for them. He had to ask for something to be done by Abraham, which was not allowed to be done. And interestingly, in that parable, it's the rich man who's complaining of being uncomfortable, but he's complaining in hell. He's complaining he wants water. He says, can you send Lazarus to bring me some water? And so therefore, I normally tell people, when your mother or grandfather's passed away and is appear in your dream and is thirsty, and it's just an indication that they've been made it to heaven. So they can't be an ancestor. They can't mediate between you and God because they're not there to begin with. They're complaining because they didn't make it. If that's them, you're hearing from. Because the Bible says in John chapter 4, Jesus said, the woman of the well, if you drink of this water, you shall thirst again. But if you drink of this water, you shall never thirst again forever. So you can't be in heaven and be thirsty. It's impossible because the water of life is there. So if people can be with God in God's presence and be uncomfortable, that means God has made a mess of heaven. How do we trust him to sort life out here on earth if he cannot do a good job in heaven where he is? It just accuses God of deficiency. So it's not possible, therefore, to talk to the dead. People can only talk to familiar spirits, which is what exactly they're doing.
And then a very quick one, sir, is, do Africans actually believe in God? And then what's the relationship between God and the ancestors? Because there's also that dynamic, where I guess the missionaries came and they said, no, these people are non-believers and they don't necessarily know God. We need to teach them God. And then there's also the fact that, there's this dynamic where you see the ancestors playing a bigger role. So what's your take on that relationship?
Look, the Bible says in the book of Acts, when Paul addresses the people of Athens, that God had not left himself without a witness. Right? So that God, in every nation on earth, God has left himself with a witness. He has left an imprint. So even Romans 1 talks about that, even the Gentiles without the law had the law of conscience. So people had a sense of a supreme being, of a person who was a preeminent factor in their lives, the causal factor, the first cause. So it existed even indigenous and innate in the heart of people, so that they're without excuse, as Paul says, that even nature tells them. So the idea of God has existed in different nations, and there's even derivative names of God that exist in different nations. But who God is has not been revealed to African people or any other nation on earth, except the Jews. So I say the idea of God has always existed, but not God. So we need to separate these two things here. So the identity of God and the true worship of God has not existed. The idea of God has always existed. So when people make that claim, they're often excusing behaviors that God is opposed to. They say that not to say, let's go back to God we've always known. They've made that argument to say, we've always known God, let's go back. No, they make the argument to justify why they should turn away from God and do what is abominations before God. So they're using that as an escape system to say, look, don't tell us. But they want a God that is malleable, a God that can make it their own shape and form. They don't want a God with universal law. In African spirituality, God is seen to be lacking communicative competence and definitive personality traits. He exists, but in name only. He doesn't have a personality. He doesn't have a will of his own. Doesn't speak. He's abstract. He's distant. So he's just there, but we don't have to deal with him. We've got other things to deal with.
That's actually very true. I've noticed a lot on, in a lot of African cultures, in the Yoruba, God delegates even the work of creation to other lesser gods to sort of do it on his behalf, and the ancestors are almost ruling, running our personal daily lives. But God is there, but he's just in the background. So yeah, that's very true. So I want to get into another very interesting question that usually comes up, and there's this one channel run by Ugogo Dineo. She's very popular. She has 1 million followers on YouTube. And there's a minister that came on once on her channel and actually said that he could make a case in the Bible for why people could venerate ancestors, like the Bible actually encouraged it. And he spoke about 1 Samuel chapter 28, yes, where Saul comes, and I think Israel was being attacked by the Philistines, and so God didn't want to speak to him through the prophets and so on. And so he went and found this medium, and the medium seems to have pulled up, Samuel, I guess, from the dead. It sounds like that's what it's saying. So then he's made a case from that saying, no, I think the Bible says this is okay. So I wanted to hear your take on that.
Did you use any other passage except that one?
He used that one. There's also in the New Testament, he spoke about Jesus on the mountain. Yes.
Of transfiguration.
Jesus' transfiguration. Yeah. So here's Jesus speaking to his ancestors, Moses and Elijah. Why can't we speak to our own? Yeah. So those were pretty much the main sort of arguments that he was building from.
Which is, those are the favorite ones of people who want to deviate from biblical truth. There are a couple of things that you would notice on when people do this. Number one, they will ignore everything else that is not conforming to their subjective bias and their confirmation bias. Now, if we go to 1 Samuel 28, and many of us have really grappled with this text quite a lot in different platforms, it's not difficult to understand that text. It's just that you have to have a deviance in your mind and a preconceived notion. Firstly, you have to deal with Bible scripture interprets scripture. That's a biblical principle. So you must have had an incident of that nature, or a command of that nature, or a precedent alluding to that as being a reality. It can't appear once in the Old Testament, 37 books of the Old Testament. So once something appears once, that's an indication that your interpretation of it must be a problem. So the fact that in the Old Testament can refer to one text, one chapter, which is very ambiguous, is exactly what it means. But it's interpreted well when you read other texts like 1 Chronicles 10, 13 and 14, which also chronicles that incident, but shows another perspective of it. Where the Bible says that God killed Saul for not consulting with the Lord. Now, here's the question. Why would God refuse to talk to Saul, and then Saul still achieves the purpose of hearing from the supernatural without God? Is it possible to go behind God and get what you want, regardless of what God thinks? Is it possible to go against God, circumvent God's will? He doesn't want to speak to you, but nonetheless, you can still get it even without him. You can circumvent his will and somehow do something he prohibits and get results from it and is okay with it. That's not possible. Just the logic of it. 1 Chronicles 10, 13, and 14 says God killed Saul for not consulting with the Lord. The prophets, the Urim, and the dreams are the three ways in which God spoke to the people of Israel. Either speak to the Urim and the Thummim, the prophet and the dreams, and he did not speak to him through all these three mechanisms. Why would God speak to Saul through a witch, through a medium? Well, the Bible says, you shall not permit a witch to live. And this woman is at Endor, and Samuel is buried in Ramah, his hometown. So they're not even at Samuel's grave physically. They're in a different town. So you have to have a theology that is so warped to believe that a righteous person can be called out by a medium anywhere the medium is.
Against the will
and
of
God
God.
has no control over that. Yes, against the will of God. That must be a theology. It must be and it's a warped theology. So again, it fits into what we touched on. This is a minister who's influenced by African spirituality, which says God is transcendent, which says God is uninvolved, which says God is distant. We can do whatever we like because he's not involved. Now, that's what this perspective is, that we can do what we want, even if God is not desiring, because he's not involved anyway, right? So, and he cannot do nothing. There's no consequence. There's no sense. So that's his belief system. If God says, don't practice witchcraft, we can practice witchcraft, and God cannot do anything against us because he's not involved here. So therefore, that portion, that passage, I deal with that quite extensively on one of my books, and I explain that a familiar spirit comes to you in familiar forms and speaks to you familiar things to deceive you. It will not be deceptive if it spoke to you unfamiliar things. If it is an unfamiliar spirit, no one can dream of an unfamiliar person. If the devil meant to deceive you, he has to show you your grandma. It must be the grandma's face, her voice, and she must say things you'll be familiar with. That's how the deception works. If it was true, that this could happen, truth is universal. It should happen to every other person on earth, not only African people, because there's no ethnic-based spiritual path. There's no spiritual path that is based on one's ethnicity. Everything that is truthful for all people all over the world. Yeah, so God will not prohibit necromancy, the consultation of the dead, for everybody else and open it up for Africans.
That's very true, because you then have to ask yourself, what are the ancestors of the Europeans doing at the moment? Are they not speaking to them? And, why is this happening only here? And I was also doing a video recently questioning the whole Muti thing. Why is it only working on Africans? It seems to have no power when it comes to, but it only works here in the familiar space.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think
you've
said it well. Yeah.
The answer to that question that you were asking is based on Numbers 23, where Balaam says there is no divination against Israel. There's no sorcerer against Jacob. The actual translation says there is no divination in Israel and sorcery in Jacob, which meant that whenever Israel was not dependent on divination and sorcery, these two things cannot work against them. So Balaam could not use divination and sorcery against Israel as long as Israel were not dependent. Jesus says in the Gospel, the prince of this world is coming, but he has nothing on me. So the only people who are vulnerable to witchcraft and divination are people who themselves have either participated or have a bloodline that is corrupted by these things. So once you break that covenant, there is no way witchcraft can touch you. There's no way that diviners can touch you. So the reason why Muti is happy is working is because people have an opening and a vulnerability to it.
I think you touched also a little bit on the familiar spirits, but I think it's quite a big thing that I guess one of the biggest deceptions, and you'll see a lot of young people now becoming Izangoma or Bayatwasa, and I guess for some of them, it might be genuine that they do see something, but you don't, we can always acknowledge that they see something, because maybe for us to be able to engage them, we can't necessarily just dismiss this thing as, no, it's, it's just, there's no such thing, but that there's certainly something that they see. But now the question is, what is it that they see? If these people are not our ancestors, then we have to ask our question as to what is actually this thing that seems to be giving an experience to these people.
Yeah, and it is indeed an experience, and it's correct. It's been correct for us to be dismissive of it. because we're dealing with people who are really troubled, people who are really traumatized, and they were harassed by these spirits. Look, these ancestral spirits are not the spirits of your ancestors. These are spirits, indeed, ancestral spirits. Your ancestors are not them, are not the ones appearing to you, and neither therefore they're not demons. Therefore, we can't demonize dead people. It's demons who appear as dead people, who hijack the image of people's ancestors and use their voice. And because, how do you know this? Acts 16, verse 16. Luke writes, one day we're going to a place of prayer, and we're met by the slave girl with a spirit of divination who told us many things. And she made a lot of money for her masters by fortune telling. So the words she spoke were accurate, but the source was inaccurate. But in that case, Paul cast out that spirit. Now, if divination were a gift, you can't cast out a gift. You can only cast out a spirit. So there we see that is not a gift, it's a spirit. By the way, gift is something you get. I give you, which we have a right to refuse. People say somebody's gifted, but why is he forced into? Because the gift is never forced. And the Bible says also, all good and perfect gifts come from the Lord, who's the Father of lights and who there's no shadow of turning. So people saying this is a gift, they either say God is schizophrenic, he gives a gift and then he speaks against it, or they admit that it's the gift that is not from God. So one or two things that position they must take. This is not a gift. And incidentally, to you to be a diviner, you have to be possessed. You cannot be a diviner without being possessed. So the training to be a diviner, which is a 3 to 6 months training, is to open your body up to be channeled or to be taken over by this spirit. So you become a channel, a medium. And therefore you have to be possessed in order for you to be a diviner. And Christianity is about casting out spirit. So there's never going to be compatibility between this practice and Christianity, because we are told that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, 1 Corinthians 6:19. The only spirit we're supposed to be open to is one of the prefix holy. Because why? There's a reason why. It's not because God is trying to be superior. It's because we're bought. He said, Paul makes the logic there. He says, because we're bought with a price, we don't belong to ourselves. Therefore, glorify God in your bodies, which are his. They are his not by virtue that God is a control freak. They are his because he bought them. He paid a price to buy us out of a previous control mechanism, buy us out so that we belong to him. Now, as long as you can't buy a house and the previous owner insists on staying in it, there'll be a problem.
Absolutely.
It'll be a problem. It can't happen.
No, I think you've pretty much explained it very well. So I suppose maybe just one thing to touch on would be, how different is the calling? I mean, as a Sangoma pretty much is somebody who's called to minister, I guess, to a degree in the things of African spirituality. And then you'll have a calling for somebody to ministry. How different are these callings? Because, I've tried to, wrestle with this thing in my mind. Like, you look at people being called, but it always seems to be a very violent way of calling people. Like, if they refuse to be, to become a Sangoma when these spirits are calling them, I mean, they can get sick or they, can God call people like that? I mean, is there any hint of this thing being close to divinity or to the way that God would call people?
No, one of the things that we see in the Bible, that we see from the very, very, very beginning, that God gave people a free will. So he made human beings free moral agent. We see that with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That's what God respects. That he respects people's will. That's why he wills people to be saved, but it doesn't make people to be saved. He wills, he appeals, he convicts, but it doesn't force people to become saved or to be worshipers or to believe in him. This one is different. And we're dealing right now with very, very impatient ancestors, if we use the term. Because we knew about diviners way back in the back, but we've never seen them so impatient that they can't wait for the child to finish school. And everybody everywhere. So we're dealing with a different thing now altogether than what we grew up under. We've never seen this. It's because it's been empowered by the false narrative that African people have their own belief system, that we must go back to where we come from. And ask people, how far back do we go? What do you mean go back to where we come? Do you know where we come from? Or do you mean 600 years ago? Or you're going to go back as far as your historical knowledge ends or your data ends? Now, don't just go back to where it suits you. Let's go back all the way back to where life began. And no one was interested in doing that because they know it's going to change their narrative. So the obsession, therefore, with the past. Now, if you want to open the door to the past, you must at least be aware of what comes through that door. Because the past is the reason why it's called the past. Everyone in the past has an issue. The people in the past have there's murders, there's incest, there's cannibalism, white, black, everyone's past has some issues in there. Paganism. And I'm sure you've had the claim that Christianity comes from Europe. And you know that it's not even needing the Bible to defend that. Just it's historical revisionism. You don't even need the Bible. Just put the Bible aside and let's read history. Let's just read history by itself. It just debunks that, Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose maybe one of the things that I'm seeing that these narratives are flourishing so much is also the fact that, I don't know if I can, I don't know if people will be insulted, but we do tend to be not very literate in Africa. So in other words, people don't want to go look at things for themselves. So if the culture is moving that way, I can move that way. Or if there are people that seem like I can trust them, that are public speakers, that are saying all of this, and we sort of easily get swayed and we do these things. But I guess maybe the question would be, how important is it for you to go study the Bible for yourself, for you to do some other research outside of that and really be equipped to deal, because we're in a very, very awkward season in our time and country. Yeah.
You're not being insulted when you're saying that, but you're being correct. Look, the culture, the way it's formed, you understand the different cultures that exist in South Africa, primarily the dominant cultural system, the Western culture and the African culture. The Western culture, the individual defines society. African culture, society defines the individual. So they come from two different ends. One is individualistic, one is communal. A communal culture has plus and negatives, and individual culture has plus and negatives. One inter-individual culture encourages entrepreneurship, it encourages adventures, how to go out and try new things, industrious, personal accountability, but it can also bring up in terms of selfishness and also abuse and certain things. So that is plus, and communal culture encourages hospitality, encourages communal for focus and care for each other. It takes a village to raise a child, all those altruisms. But also it encourages an environment of lack of personal accountability, where you are just a collectivist mindset, where you cannot think independent of the collective. Otherwise, you'll be censored, you'll be isolated. So therefore, what you're appealing for is that people, while they are so-called homogeneous groups, they still have a mind that is independent. They are given their own mind. We're not given a collective mind. We might have a mindset, but we have our own individual mind, which we have a right to exercise. And exercise the mind means you become critical. You even question me as a preacher, as Paul did, was faced in Berea, where they went and searched the scriptures to see if the things that Paul spoke about are true. And so, therefore, people just research themselves. They check, okay, the Bible is written by what people to oppress by people. Okay, let's put the Bible aside. Let's just deal with that logical. That's even logical enough. Let's forget the echo chamber. Let's forget how it sounds like politically, how the fact that it's politically correct and gives you platforms and you sound like you're intelligent. Let's just deal with the logic of that. That a pagan continent could written a text which talks about a history which they did not live in, and certain things like that. And so, therefore, people need just to do the basic research on certain things and concepts. They would have discovered that things like, as you told someone, circumcision, divination, these are foreign things that people now think they can't live without, but they were never invented by us. And I ask people all the time, what were men then in Africa before circumcision? Were there no men before? Were they all just, they died boys? Because the practice is about 200 or 300 years old in the Apostle land. So what happened prior to that? Were your grandfathers all boys until they died? You never had men prior to their adoption. Are you going to claim that everybody who doesn't do it like Zulus are boys? I mean, what are the results? Let's see the persons, what their achievement is. Do they have good families? Are they achieving? Are they in education? How do you prove the superiority of your practice to other people practically, not theory? How do you say practically you are better off by doing this compared to somebody who doesn't do it? Show us the advantage you have when you consult the dead, when you got dual assistance, I call it, you can pray to God and ancestors. You have double assistance. Show that it's advantageous to you compared to somebody who just prays to God. Show that you have a superiority.
I think that is a very good note to end it. And I want to encourage all of you who will be watching to please write some questions for us in the comment section so that we can have an excuse to call Pastor Afrika back to our channel. But thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us. And we'll see you guys in the next video.